They erased him from history books because he almost brought the British Empire to its knees. One tribal chief with homemade weapons fought the most powerful army in the world. What happened next will shock you. The year is 1829. The British Empire controls half the world. Their army is unstoppable. Their weapons are the most advanced. Their strategy is flawless. But in the misty hills of Meghalaya, one man says no. His name is Tiro Singh. He's a Khasi chief who refuses to bow down. And what he's about to do will spark one of the fiercest tribal resistances in Indian history. The British thought they could just walk through Khasi land and build their road to Burma. They thought wrong. This is the story of the Anglo-Khasi War, a war that the British tried to hide, a hero they tried to erase, and a rebellion that changed everything. Stay with me because the truth about what really happened is nothing like what you've been told. Let me take you back to the early 1800s. The Khasi Hills, which is now part of Meghalaya, was a completely different world. Picture this: dense forests covering rolling hills, clouds so thick you can't see 10 feet ahead, rivers cutting through deep valleys. And in this landscape, the Khasi people had built their own civilization. The Khasis weren't just random tribes living in the jungle. They had one of the most advanced social systems you can imagine. They followed a matrilineal system, which means property and family names passed through women, not men. The youngest daughter inherited everything. Women had rights and respect that even European women didn't have at that time. Think about that for a second. In 1800s Britain, women couldn't own property, but in the Khasi Hills, women were the backbone of society. The Khasis lived in what they called Hema, which were basically small kingdoms. Each Hema was ruled by a chief called a Syiem. But here's the interesting part. The Syiem wasn't a dictator. He had to consult with a council called the Dorbar. This council included clan leaders and respected elders. Major decisions were made collectively. It was democracy before the British even knew what that word meant. There were about 25 Khasi states at this time. They were independent, but connected through trade and cultural ties. They had their own laws called Khasi customary law. They had their own religion, worshipping a supreme goddess called Khable Sinshur and maintaining sacred groves. They had markets where people from different hills would come to trade. Betel nuts, oranges, honey, cotton, iron implements. The economy was thriving. Now let's talk about Tirot Singh. He was born around 1802 in Nongklao, which was one of the most powerful Khasi states. Nongklao wasn't just any state, it controlled important trade routes between the Brahmaputra Valley and the Surma Valley. It was strategically located and economically strong. Tiro Singh became the Syiem of Nongklao when he was very young, probably in his early 20s. Some accounts say he became chief after his uncle died. Others say there was a succession dispute that he won. Either way, by 1826, he was the ruler. Here's what you need to understand about Tiro Singh. He wasn't some uneducated tribal chief like the British portrayed him. He was intelligent, he was strategic, he understood politics, and most importantly, he loved his people and his land. Now the British East India Company shows up in the picture. They had just finished the First Anglo-Burmese War in 1826. They defeated Burma and took control of Assam. Suddenly, they had a problem. How do you connect Bengal with Assam? The Brahmaputra River was one option, but it was dangerous and seasonal. So they came up with a plan: build a road through the Khasi Hills. On paper, it sounds simple. Just build a road. But this road would cut right through Khasi territory. It would go through Nongklao. And the British didn't ask for permission. They demanded it. The British sent David Scott as the agent to the Governor-General for the northeast frontier. This guy was smooth. He knew he couldn't just invade the Khasi Hills. The terrain was too difficult. The people were fierce warriors. So he decided to use diplomacy. Actually, let me correct that. He decided to use manipulation disguised as diplomacy. David Scott approached Tiro Singh in 1826. He said the British wanted to build a road through Nongklao to connect Guwahati and Assam to Sylhet in Bengal. He promised that this road would bring trade and prosperity. He said the British would pay for the right to build. He made it sound like a great deal. Tiro Singh was young and probably thought he could trust them. Big mistake. In early 1827, Tiro Singh agreed to let the British build the road. They signed a treaty. The British promised to pay him annually for the right of way. They promised not to interfere in internal matters. They promised to respect Khasi customs and laws. All lies. The British immediately started work on the road. But they also did something else. They started building military posts along the route. They established a garrison at Cherrapunji, which was in another Khasi state. They brought in troops. They brought in weapons. They were preparing for conquest, not just building a road. Tiro Singh realized what was happening. The British weren't keeping their promises. They weren't paying what they promised. They were treating his people like servants. British soldiers were behaving badly with local women. They were cutting down sacred groves for timber. They were disrespecting Khasi customs. And worst of all, they were building military infrastructure to take over. Tiro Singh tried talking to David Scott. He sent messengers. He complained about the violations. Scott would make excuses. He'd promised to fix things. But nothing changed. The British kept pushing. They kept encroaching. They kept preparing for takeover. By early 1829, Tiro Singh had enough. He called a meeting of the Dorbar, his council. They discussed what to do. Some people said they should keep negotiating. Some said they should just accept British control because fighting would be suicide. But Tiro Singh said no. He said if they surrendered without a fight, they would lose everything. Their land, their freedom, their dignity. He said it was better to die fighting than to live as slaves. The Dorbar agreed. They decided to resist. But they knew they couldn't fight the British in open battle. The British had guns, cannons, trained soldiers. The Khasis had bows and arrows, spears, swords, and shields. So they decided to use their knowledge of the terrain. They would fight a guerrilla war. Tiro Singh started preparing. He sent messengers to other Khasi states asking for support. Many chiefs agreed to join. Not all of them, but many. He gathered his warriors. The Khasis were excellent fighters. They knew every path, every cave, every shortcut in those hills. They could move through the forest silently. They could disappear into the mist. On April 4, 1829, Tiro Singh launched his attack. The target was the British garrison and the workers building the road. The attack came at dawn. The British were caught completely off guard. The Khasi warriors came from all directions. They used the terrain perfectly. They attacked, killed, and disappeared before the British could organize a response. The attack was devastating. 2 British officers were killed, Lieutenant Bedingfield and Lieutenant Burleton. These weren't just random soldiers. These were important officers. Several other British personnel and many Indian workers were killed. The survivors ran for their lives. The news of this attack sent shockwaves through the British administration. David Scott was furious. How dare these tribals attack the mighty British? The British immediately decided to crush this rebellion with full force. They sent troops from different directions. They brought in reinforcements. They prepared for war. But here's the thing. The British totally underestimated Tiro Singh and the Khasis. They thought this would be over in a few weeks. They thought a show of force would make the tribals surrender. They had no idea what they were up against. The Anglo-Khasi War had begun, and it would last for 4 brutal years. The British launched their first major campaign in April 1829, right after Tiro Singh's initial attack. They sent a large force under the command of Lieutenant Lister. The plan was to march into Nongkla, capture Tiro Singh, and end this quickly. The Khasi warriors let them come into the hills. Then they started attacking, not in big battles, but in small ambushes. A group of British soldiers would be marching through a narrow path. Suddenly, arrows would rain down from the trees and rocks above. By the time the soldiers figured out where the attack came from, the Khasis would be gone. Then another attack would come from a different direction. The British were fighting blind. They couldn't see their enemy. They didn't know the terrain. Their heavy weapons and cannons were useless in the dense forest and steep slopes. Their military training meant nothing when they couldn't form battle lines. Meanwhile, the Khasi warriors were fighting on their home ground. Every rock, every tree, every stream was an advantage. Lieutenant Lister's campaign failed miserably. They couldn't locate Tiro Singh. They couldn't control the territory. They couldn't even protect their own supply lines. The Khasis would attack supply convoys, take weapons and food, and vanish. After weeks of frustration and losses, the British had to retreat. David Scott was shocked. He couldn't believe a tribal chief with primitive weapons was defeating British forces. He asked for more troops. He asked for more resources. The British sent reinforcements, but the result was the same. Here's something incredible. Tiro Singh wasn't just defending Nongklaw. He was taking the fight to the British. His warriors attacked British positions in other Khasi states. They attacked Cherrapunji. They harassed British convoys traveling through the region. They destroyed the road construction. Everything the British built, the Khasis destroyed. The British tried different tactics. They tried to bribe other Khasi chiefs to betray Tirot Singh. Some chiefs did accept British bribes, but many remained loyal. They tried to cut off food supplies to the rebels. But the Khasis knew how to live off the land. They tried to use superior firepower. But in the hills, firepower meant nothing if you couldn't see your enemy. Months turned into a year. The war continued. British casualties kept mounting. Not just from combat, but from disease. The British soldiers weren't used to the climate. Malaria, dysentery, and other tropical diseases killed more soldiers than Khasi arrows. The monsoon made everything worse. The roads would turn to mud, visibility would drop to zero. Supply lines would break down. Tiro Singh, meanwhile, became a legend. Stories of his bravery spread across the Khasi Hills. He was always at the front, fighting alongside his warriors. He shared their hardships. He inspired them. Under his leadership, the Khasis fought with incredible courage. But wars take a toll. By 1830, both sides were exhausted. The British had lost hundreds of men and spent huge amounts of money. The Khasis had lost many warriors, and their villages had been burned. But neither side would surrender. The British changed their strategy. Since they couldn't defeat Tiro Singh militarily, they decided to isolate him. They intensified their efforts to win over other Khasi chiefs. They offered protection, money, and power. They played on old rivalries between different Khasi states. Slowly, some chiefs started making separate peace deals with the British. By 1831, Tiro Singh was still fighting, but he was getting isolated. Some of his allies had abandoned him. His resources were running low. The British were tightening the noose. Then came the betrayal. In January 1833, after nearly 4 years of war, Tiro Singh was captured. And here's the heartbreaking part. He wasn't captured in battle. He was betrayed by someone close to him. Different sources give different accounts of exactly how it happened. Some say he was betrayed by a rival chief who wanted to curry favor with the British. Others say he was tricked into a meeting under false pretenses. But the result was the same. The great warrior chief was in chains. The British were relieved. Finally, they had captured the man who had humiliated them for 4 years. But they also respected him. British officers who met Tiro Singh wrote in their reports that he was dignified, intelligent, and unbroken in spirit. Even in captivity, he refused to beg for mercy. The British knew they couldn't execute Tiro Singh. That would make him a martyr and could spark another rebellion. So they did something worse. They exiled him. They sent him to Dhaka, which was in Bengal, far away from his homeland. They put him in a prison there, hoping people would forget about him. But Tiro Singh never forgot his home. He never gave up hope of returning. British records show that he kept asking to be allowed to go back to the Khasi Hills. The answer was always no. He spent years in that prison, away from his people, his land, his culture. Tiro Singh died in prison in 1835. He was only about 33 years old. The exact date of his death is disputed, but most historians agree it was in July 1835. He died alone, in a foreign land, far from the hills he loved and fought for. The British thought that with Tiro Singh gone, the Khasi resistance would end. They were partly right. The organized military resistance did decrease, but the spirit of resistance never died. Small-scale attacks on British positions continued for years. The Khasis never fully accepted British rule. Now let me tell you about the impact of this war. The Anglo-Khasi War was one of the longest tribal resistances against the British in northeast India. 4 years of continuous fighting. Think about that. A tribal chief with homemade weapons fought the British Empire for 4 years. The war cost the British dearly. They lost hundreds of soldiers. They spent enormous amounts of money. They were humiliated. The British had just defeated Burma, a proper kingdom with an organized army. but they struggled for 4 years against tribal warriors. That says something about the courage and skill of Tiro Singh and his people. The war also changed British policy. After this experience, the British realized they couldn't just march into tribal areas and take over. They had to be more careful. They started using more indirect methods of control. They'd make treaties, then slowly break them. They'd use divide and rule tactics. They'd work through local chiefs who they could manipulate. But here's the tragic part. After all this sacrifice, Tiro Singh was forgotten. The British made sure of that. They didn't want future generations to know that a tribal chief had resisted them so successfully. They downplayed the war in their official records. They portrayed Tiro Singh as a savage rebel, not a freedom fighter. Even after India gained independence in 1947, Tiro Singh remained largely forgotten. History books didn't mention him. Schools didn't teach about him. Why? Because the British had written most of the history books. And after independence, historians were busy studying the mainstream independence movement. The tribal resistances were ignored. It wasn't until the 1970s and 1980s that scholars in Meghalaya started rediscovering their own history. They found old British records. They collected oral histories from Khasi communities. They pieced together the story of Tiro Singh and the Anglo-Khasi War, and they were amazed at what they found. Slowly, Tiro Singh started getting recognition. In 1991, more than 150 years after his death, the Indian government finally recognized him as a freedom fighter. A statue was erected in his honor in Shillong. A college was named after him. His story started being taught in schools in Meghalaya. But here's what's important. Tirot Singh wasn't just fighting for himself or for Nongklaw. He was fighting for the right of his people to live freely. He was fighting against foreign domination. He was fighting for dignity and self-respect. In that sense, he was one of India's first freedom fighters. Let me tell you about the Khasi warriors who fought with him. These weren't professional soldiers. They were farmers, hunters, traders. But when their land was threatened, they became warriors. They used traditional weapons, bows made from bamboo, arrows with iron tips, swords called waitlam, shields made from buffalo hide, spears, and most importantly, their knowledge of the land. The Khasi military tactics were brilliant. They never fought in open ground where British firepower would dominate. They used the forest as cover. They used the hills to their advantage. They attacked at dawn when visibility was poor. They used the monsoon rains to their advantage. They cut off supply lines. They spread false information to confuse the enemy. These are guerrilla warfare tactics that would be studied in military academies centuries later. The women of the Khasi community also played a crucial role. Remember, Khasi society was matrilineal. Women weren't just passive victims. They managed the homes while men were fighting. They grew food. They provided intelligence about British movements. They treated wounded warriors. They kept the resistance alive. The British documents from this period are fascinating. British officers wrote letters complaining about how difficult the Khasis were to fight. They wrote about the terrain. They wrote about the weather. They wrote about their frustration at not being able to catch Tiro Singh. One British officer wrote that fighting in the Khasi Hills was worse than fighting in any other part of India. David Scott, the British officer who started all this, died in 1831, before the war even ended. Some say the stress of the failed campaign contributed to his death. The road he wanted to build was eventually completed, but it took much longer and cost much more than anyone expected. Now here's the most powerful part of this story. Tiro Singh knew he couldn't win. Let me repeat that. He knew from the beginning that he couldn't defeat the British Empire. The British had unlimited resources. They had modern weapons. They could bring in reinforcements from across the world. Tiro Singh had a few thousand tribal warriors with traditional weapons, but he fought anyway. Why? Because some things are worth fighting for even when you know you'll lose. Freedom is worth fighting for. Dignity is worth fighting for. The right to live on your own land according to your own customs is worth fighting for. Tiro Singh understood this. He chose to resist rather than surrender. He chose to fight rather than submit. And you know what? In a way, he did win. He couldn't stop the British from eventually taking over, but he made them pay a heavy price. He showed the world that the British weren't invincible. He inspired future generations. The seed of resistance he planted grew into the tree of freedom. When India finally became independent in 1947, it was because of countless freedom fighters. We know about Gandhi, Nehru, Bose, but we forget about Tiro Singh and thousands of other tribal leaders who resisted colonialism long before the mainstream independence movement even started. Tiro Singh's rebellion showed that resistance wasn't futile. It showed that one person with courage could inspire thousands. It showed that no empire, no matter how powerful, could completely crush the human spirit. The Anglo-Khasi War and Tiro Singh's rebellion teach us several important lessons. First, that real heroes often come from unexpected places. Tiro Singh wasn't educated in British schools. He wasn't part of the urban elite. He was a tribal chief from the hills. But he had more courage and principle than most educated people of his time. Second, that history is written by the victors. The British tried to erase Tiro Singh from history. They succeeded for over a century. It's only now that his story is being told. How many other heroes have been forgotten? How many other stories of resistance have been lost? Third, that indigenous people weren't passive victims of colonialism. They fought back. They resisted. They sacrificed everything for their freedom. The narrative that tribals were primitive and needed British civilization is a lie. The Khasis had their own advanced civilization. They had democracy, women's rights, and sustainable practices long before the British. Fourth, that the tactics used by colonial powers were brutal and manipulative. The British didn't just use military force. They used deception, divide and rule, betrayal, and psychological warfare. They broke treaties. They manipulated internal conflicts. They turned brothers against brothers. Finally, that the struggle for freedom is never easy. It requires sacrifice. Tiro Singh sacrificed his freedom, his home, his life. Thousands of Khasi warriors died. Villages were burned. Families were destroyed. But their sacrifice wasn't in vain. They kept the flame of resistance alive. Today, Tiro Singh is celebrated as a hero in Meghalaya. His death anniversary is observed as Tiro Singh Day. Students learn about him in schools. His statue stands proud in Shillong, but he should be celebrated across India. His story should be known by every Indian. He was a freedom fighter who resisted the British decades before the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857, which is often called the First War of Indian Independence. The Anglo-Khasi War wasn't just a tribal rebellion. It was a fight for freedom, dignity, and self-determination. It was a chapter in India's long struggle against colonialism. And Tiro Singh wasn't just a tribal chief. He was a visionary leader who understood that freedom is worth any sacrifice. The misty hills of Meghalaya still remember their hero. The sacred groves still whisper his name. The rivers still carry stories of his courage. Tiro Singh may have died in a British prison, but his spirit never surrendered. His legacy lives on in every person who refuses to bow down to injustice. His story reminds us that one person, with courage and principle, can stand against an empire. And even if they fall standing tall. Hit subscribe to discover more forgotten heroes who changed history.